Well, thank you very much. I've much enjoyed my connection with Cirque, I have to say, and my opportunity to meet some of the colleagues here, and co-supervising a PhD with Helen of Momoko Kadada, which was on women's seafarers, which was totally riveting, I have to say. And I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to read this book, which I have to say is fabulously well written. I read it in one sitting. I was just so gripped by it. And I think it's remarkable in many ways, but it's also extremely important. And I want to follow up a little bit on Phil's comments about, so what are the implications of all of this? Because in many senses, it's a very sad book in describing a very difficult life on sea. Now, I'm sure life at sea has always been difficult, but some of the changes that we're hearing about in terms, for example, of the split between the ship owner and the captain, the ship owners not coming on board in the same way that they used to, not being as familiar with what life would be like for seafarers on those ships, I think is leading to deterioration in some of the standards of living, the accommodation and the social intercourse of seafarers, which makes life extremely difficult. So this is an important study in many ways. It talks particularly about transnational communities, and increasingly the seafaring population on a ship will be made up of people obviously of different ranks, but also of different nationalities, and that can have profound implications for communication and what one can do in terms of having a social life with your colleagues on board ships. And it can reduce it in some ways to things that don't require a lot of speech, like films of various kinds, shall I say, card games, these kinds of things that don't rely on talking. But what's interesting, I think, particularly about the book, is the way it talks about the interrelationship between status and nationality, with some of her respondents saying that mixed crews, by which I mean crews from different countries, actually end up adhering much more closely in a way to the hierarchy of the rank that you are in terms of your role on the ship. And that it's argued that this can be safer in effect and to lead to less violence, which I think is extremely interesting. So there's that distance that's implied really by people coming from different countries, and then the hierarchy kicks in. But one of the most moving things about the book, I think, is the way that life is described. And if I may, I just read a few sentences. What Helen says is, aboard ship, life is isolated. Sometimes in the peace of a sunset, watching a school of spinner dolphins on the horizon, such isolation can be welcome. Traversing empty expanses of ocean, there are some magical experiences to be had. Whether these include watching the Southern Cross high above you, set against dark velvet skies, or looking in wonder at streams of phosphorescent algae lighting up the water as it's broken by the ship's bow. More often than not, however, life aboard a merchant cargo vessel is noisy, lonely, and dangerous. Seafarers are vulnerable workers. They work on very long, generally temporary contracts and can be hired and fired at will. They consider that the work and the life are something to be endured. And quite a lot of the discussion of the conversations that Helen had with people talk about enduring or surviving life on board ship. Now, one of the issues there, it seems to me, is the way in which there are certain limitations on the extent to which seafarers get close to each other. In other words, they don't get close to each other. There's no connection. You can't really bond with somebody furiously because of the comings and goings that we described. Because at the next port, that person may have come to the end of their shift, as it were, off they go, and you may never see them again. So you're not going to invest in getting close to people in that kind of context. At the same time, you can't fall out with somebody in a terribly big way and think, well, I'll just never have anything to do with them, because they're going to be on board the ship and you've got to do business with them. So there are certain things that you will talk about and won't talk about. So you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion, and you don't talk about anything personal. And certainly I can remember my son saying this, that if somebody got really bad news that one of the opportunities that they had for communication, they wouldn't share it. And you might sense that something had happened because they'd be very quiet, but they would never communicate this to you. So those relationships were functional ones. They weren't ones where people could really get close. And the comings and goings, that kind of pattern of life, really meant it was difficult in any senses to get close. But Helen talked not just to seafarers, the ones that she was studying in ethnography, not just to people who wanted to be seafarers or were trying to get a ship in places like Hamburg, particularly from Ghana and Cape Verde, but she also talked to seafarers' families, and that was extremely interesting too. She talked particularly to seafarers' wives who said, while the seafarer was away, of course, the wife had to do everything. And when the seafarer came back, in order not for the seafarer to lack function in the family, the wife almost had to undo her control over everything working. So there was a sort of difficult tension in that relationship as a consequence. And sometimes she just wished they'd go and catch the next ship, get out of the way and stop cluttering up the place almost by trying to help. So in a sense, for the seafarer, then where do you belong? You know, on board ship, your relationships are very compromised by the situation in which those relationships develop. But at the same time, at home, there's a difficulty because you're there all the time. Everybody else has got their lives, their jobs, their things to do, and you're kind of hanging around really on perhaps a month or a 6-week period, and it's difficult to fit in, it's difficult to belong then in that family, in that community, in a very meaningful way. So I think this book is extremely important. I think the ideas of transnational communities is extremely interesting. Helen describes the differences for Ghanaians and people from the Cape Verde Islands in Hamburg, in the extent to which they can see themselves as a community in a different place or not, and compared that with the Filipino communities where there may be women working in places like Hamburg, obviously big shipping area, working on land, so you could almost reconstitute a Filipino society within Hamburg because you had everybody there. It's extremely difficult, it seems to me, to read this as somebody who knows not very much about seafaring. I have to say, apart from my connection with seafaring and being the mother of a seafarer, to say it looks partly like a car crash waiting to happen, that the deterioration in the life circumstances of people on some of these ships means, and the way in which the seafarers talk about enduring and surviving, and the terrible feelings people have if they can't get off when they're supposed to get off, their period on board that particular ship is extended. Something really has to be done about this, it seems to me, if we're going to have seafaring in the future. Those lives and the difficulties that seafarers face badly need to be addressed if seafaring is to continue. Thank you very much.